I'd like to start, of course, by thanking the organisers for inviting me to this meeting. When I got the invitation, you might guess from what Kenny just said that I was just a little surprised, because one thing I don't work on is the evolution of language. Not even really the evolution of communication or primate communication. What I could claim to be something of an expert on is the evolution of culture. And I think, from what I understood, it's to tell you something about that that I'm here, particularly including our comparative approaches. So to begin with, it sounded a bit odd, but then as I began to think about it, yeah, it makes sense. After all, we wouldn't be the kind of language-using species we are unless we were already highly cultural animals. Children learn their language, as it were, we might say, as one of many things from the culture they're born into. And it works the other way around as well. So once some kind of phenomenon we'd like to call language exists, it can feed into culture. And the kind of language we've got now, for example, can be used to teach and pass on aspects of culture. However, as something of an outsider to this field, I can see my colleagues who work on primate communication, for example, striving to bridge this gap, as it were, to human language, which I seem to think is something of a kind of yawning gulf. There is nothing really quite like human language in animal communication in general, although, of course, there are interesting links that can be made. We've heard several of those this morning already. But if we switch to taking account of culture, then many researchers are at least prepared to use the same word in referring to what goes on in the non-human parts of the animal of the world. And in some ways, I think that means that the two phenomena can stand closer together, and it makes it more tractable to build or to construct the evolutionary bridges between what we can infer must have been ancestral from our analyses of primate culture, for example, and human culture. At least that's my approach, and in a way, that's why I've been doing what I've been doing rather than what you've been doing, because it just seemed particularly tractable to me through the kind of experiments Kenny's just mentioned, and which I'll be telling you more about. So we've got those comparative aspects illustrated in the cover of that book, which I and others edited a few years ago, as it were, telling this story. And in addition, there's the cover of the philosophical transactions issue that led to the book. We've got this vast archaeological record as well for cultural evolution, human cultural evolution. Stuff on the cover there goes back over 100,000 years ago, and of course, if you look at the Stone Age, well, we're talking about 3.5 million years ago of a record. And that gives us a kind of time machine, which I guess is more a problem if you're trying to study the evolution of language. So here's an outline of my talk. It's in three parts, really. The first is about the evolutionary ancestry of culture, particularly constructed through inferences from comparative primatology and beyond. So it says in the title there, pre-human culture, and that's inferred on the basis of what we can tell from contemporary primates and other animals. And I think that was really what I was brought here to do. But then as I started constructing the talk, I thought, well, there's a second topic, which is more specifically vocal and gestural culture and the possible origins of that in our primate ancestry. That takes me beyond my own research, but I've been doing a little bit of work on that to try and see, so what's the story there? And I'll say a little about that. And then in the third and final component of the talk, I'll refer to what I'm calling here cultural cognition, other than vocal and gestural transmission, which I think four things I can talk about are relevant to language evolution. Copying sequential and hierarchical structure, what's been called rational imitation, recognizing what it is to copy others, to imitate, for example, and then finally a bit about cumulative culture, because of course language is an aspect of our distinctive human cumulative culture. So let's take this first one, which, as I say, I think I was brought here to talk about. That's going to be about half the talk. Start with this evolutionary phylogeny of the old world primates, the monkeys at the bottom, the apes at the top. If we blow that up a little to just focus in on the great apes, well, you know who these guys are, I guess. And of course, we, the great apes, share certain morphological, anatomical features. We have a kind of flattened dorsoventral body. We can hang from our arms. We can brachiate. We can move our arms up there in ways monkeys can't. We don't have a tail. We have a large brain in both absolute and relative terms, and so on. So that it's really quite feasible to reconstruct what our common ancestor, first of all, say with chimpanzees, must have looked like, and then the ancestor of all the great apes, a kind of generalized ape, reconstructed from the features that all these great apes share. And I think those of us who are trying to use this kind of comparative research to reconstruct evolution, I think are generally taking this comparative approach. So we're certainly not making the mistake of saying chimpanzees, clearly chimpanzees are not our ancestors, nor was our ancestor, even that we shared with chimpanzee, particularly, specifically like a chimpanzee, but rather the analysis is through shared features. And I've already heard one or two talks this morning lay out that kind of rationale, so I hope we're on the same page with that. My own analyses of this have dissected culture, when we're wanting to do this kind of comparison, into three major kind of components. And I'm starting from the position that we've already got empirical evidence that in whatever species we're looking at traditions. That's to say, behaviors, or it might be other things like attitudes or artifacts, phenomena that are passed on by social learning and spread across communities and perhaps across generations. And I put on this slide a couple of examples, procession at the top there, a human example, and down at the bottom I'm illustrating the birdsong dialects, which I'm sure you probably all know about, fall into this category of traditions defined in that way. And the first of the three things we can make compare and comparison analyses of is the population level patterning of those traditions, how they're distributed in space and over time. And although the content of them may be different, they may be as different as this human procession and birdsong dialects, we might find that the way they're actually patterned in space and the way they change over time share certain characteristics. And also, they may differ, and that's what we're doing all the time, a compare and contrast operation. We could also look at the cultural contents. Well, here are two examples that look really very different. But then again, well, we humans have dialect differences which are distributed across space and change over time. If we're making human-chimpanzee comparisons, then the material culture of chimpanzees, the fact that they use tools very extensively, the most extensive in the animal kingdom, it is a similarity in cultural contents at a certain level of abstraction in our analyses, and that's what I'm referring to there. And then the third and final thing is the actual transmission mechanisms which allow behaviors or whatever phenomena we're talking about to be transmitted. Mechanisms such as imitation, teaching, or much simpler kind of social learning processes. So if we take those three, in my analysis, I've then divided them further into various subcategories, and I'm not going to go into all the detail of this, but in abstract terms, you can imagine these are characteristics which are found very fully and comprehensively in the human case. We say, though, set those out, and then we ask for another species, such as chimpanzees, how are they distributed? And we find that, well, there's evidence for at least some of them may be a bit different in themselves, some may be similar, and from those we make inferences about what the culture of our common ancestor is likely to have been like. And then we can extend that process, for example, to other great apes. I've just put the orangutan here because it's with orangutans we share a common ancestor about 14 million years ago or so, and perhaps we find some other similarities there. We expect perhaps not quite so many, and the further we go down our family tree to earlier times, then perhaps the less similarities we're likely to find. But When we do find those similarities, then we attribute those to a common ancestor, such as the ancestor of all the great apes. Well, I'm not going to take you all through the detail of that. I can't do that because I want to fit in some other things in the talk, but I want to set that out and then show this figure, which you might say is the figure you should never show in a talk. I'm not putting that up there to take you through it or expect you to read it. There's the reference if you want to go into that. What I've done here is to take those three major categories, and you can see they're the various subcategories that they're divided into. And this column here is our conclusions about the shared features. And perhaps the main point of this diagram is to say, well, there's a lot of those. There's a lot we've identified. And then the final column is what's distinctive in humans. And often that looks quite almost absurd because we've counted many different traditions in, say, our closest relative, chimpanzees. Well, how many traditions do humans have? One can't even begin to count them. But that's what that final column is meant to do. Okay, so let's look at some of what I'm talking about there, and not going through it in that kind of stepwise sequence. I haven't got time to do that. 99, so we're nearly 20 years ago, I had the privilege, really, is the way I regard it, as being the lead author in this collaborative effort between all the leaders of the long-term chimpanzee study sites across Africa, trying to summarize what we'd learned about the differences of chimpanzee behavior across Africa, which had gradually been emerging over 10, 20, 30 or 40 years at these long-term study sites. And this was also partly guided by observations on the way chimpanzees behave, such as the way here illustrated, as you can see the way that Fifi, the juvenile on the left, is very closely peering at what her mother's doing. We see a lot of this in the great apes, and others doing some termite fishing there. So guided by that, we put together a picture on the basis of integration across these research sites, and here's the basic image we came up with, the summary icon, and our conclusion was that chimpanzees display at least 39 different cultural variations or traditions right across the central parts of Africa there. And these were defined by being very common, particularly customary as the most common, or habitual at least, done by many individuals many times, at least one side, and yet absent, so far as we can tell, without any obvious environmental or genetic explanation. So it's not that the materials are absent there. You can't read those. If I blow one up, perhaps at least the people at the front can start to read some of them and get some idea of what behaviours are involved. So the ones that are lit up there as squares are very common. Pretty much everybody, able-bodied individual, does them, at least of one age-sex class. There might be, for example, male cultures. Or circles, if they're at least very common. The blue blanks are where they're absent. And the no entry signs, well, they perhaps couldn't occur at that particular site because the raw materials are not there. And what's most striking, I think, from that are two things. One is that these behaviors cover pretty much the whole repertoire of chimpanzees. So they're very complicated ways in which sometimes they have to process their foods, the ways they use tools, multiple tools, partly for food processing, but also for other purposes such as hygiene or comfort, various aspects of social behavior, even how they groom each other and what they do with a parasite if they get it off while they're grooming. For example, I'll just give you one example at this point. In West Africa, they'll take that parasite and they'll put it on their arm and they'll squash it, and that's the way they dispatch the parasite. But if you're watching a chimpanzee in East Africa, you're particularly most likely to see it take that parasite and select a leaf, a large leaf, and put the thing on the leaf as if it's like a petri dish and inspect it. And then they might eat it, they might cast it away or do something else with it or squash it on the leaf. And then there are even courtship gambits that vary across here. Now, I don't have time to take you through all those 39, of course. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples for those who don't know this material, what it actually looks like. So you'll see a video clip here of pestle pounding, as it's called. That's the first thing in the table there, we're still in West Africa. This is a place called Botsu, and this is the only place this occurs, and yet pretty much everybody does it at this site. What happens is that the chimpanzee climbs into the top of a palm tree, which is not straightforward to do, and having got there, it lifts one of the fronds, typically, that have been left there by someone doing the behavior before, and having got what nutrition it can from the growing point of the palm manually, it then uses that big palm to beat into the top of the tree like that little cartoon there, and here you see the chimpanzee engaged on this. It's extraordinary behavior, which you see, as I say, commonly at this site, and yet you won't see it elsewhere in Africa. And that's one of two behaviors, two main tool-use behaviors that you see at this site, which research has suggested gets these animals through the dry season when their prime food of fruits dries up. So this really matters to them, to do pestle pounding and to do the other behavior, which is to crack nuts, which are available in the dry season, using natural hammers made of wood or stone. And this occurs across a region of West Africa, certainly not across the whole chimpanzee range by any means, across this area of Africa, which it spans about 500 kilometers. So we must be talking about dozens, likely scores of chimpanzee communities who are all doing this behavior. It's been observed at all 8 sites where people have gone and looked in detail, and yet it doesn't occur in the rest of Africa. There was one early record from Central Africa indicated there, never been replicated, and perhaps that was a false alarm, perhaps human remains, is what's thought. So here's what the behavior looks like, hammering with a wooden hammer, here in a tree with some success, but it's not always the case. A big stone hammer for a very hard nut, and then this just indicates that it's quite tricky to do, and youngsters tend to take several years to master it. So these are just a couple of examples of the kind of behavior that I'm talking about, and those are two amongst a large number, as you saw. And in fact, if you can tick off for a chimpanzee 1 or 2 or 3, generally, of these kind of local traditions, you can tell where the chimpanzee comes from on the basis of its cultural profile alone, as of course you can do for people across Africa as well, and other parts of the world. But this is all observational data so far. There's always the concern that maybe we haven't picked up what that subtle environmental explanation is for why the difference exists. And 1 or 2 cases, that's been shown that, that was the case. So we were too hasty in our first broad brush attempt to delineate chimpanzee cultures. But sticking on this example here of nut cracking, let's see what other kinds of evidence can be brought to bear. And I think what's great about this kind of primate research we've been able to do is by taking several different methodological approaches, we can triangulate on the existence of what we're claiming. So one thing which was done by both Phil McGrew and Christoph Birch was to go to other places in Africa where the behavior doesn't occur, but which they were able to show has all the raw materials necessary. If you know how to do it, in fact, as a human, you can do it. So there in Gabon, and in the case of the Birch et al. Study, really close to this general area of nut cracking, but separated from it by a very large river, the So River, and it seems the culture has just never got across there. And then more recent studies have honed in even more on neighboring communities. So these are all in the Thai forest, they're all nut cracking communities, but it was found they behave in different ways when they're doing it. So, for example, if you look at the 2 curves at the bottom there, you can see that the proportion of stone tools they use, which is what's illustrated here, varies by the season, which makes some sense given that the hardness of nuts varies. Yet, there's a third group that consistently sticks to using a high proportion of stone tools, and there's evidence there that as females migrate when they reach sexual maturity, which is what tends to happen in chimpanzees, it's the females who migrate, they avoid inbreeding, they will adopt the local norm. That's to say the statistical norm, not any more than that. And finally, we can add to that experimental evidence, which I think is always, to me, the strongest evidence. We can do a controlled experiment, and in the case of social learning, that's particularly powerful, because you can have a control, maybe more than one kind of control condition and experimental conditions. I mean, you might think, well, the ideal experiment to do would be to take, for example, one of those nut-cracking chimpanzees from West Africa and parachute it into East Africa, and then see, oh, so does it spread? But that wouldn't be quite ethical or really very pragmatic. So what instead we were able to do was go to East Africa, where chimpanzees don't nut-crack, and work with a group of chimpanzees in a sanctuary, which is on a little island in the middle of the very large Lake Victoria. So there's no risk that anything we introduce there will get out, as it were, and we'll play God introducing stone nut-cracking to the rest of Africa. So what we did here was, first of all, expose 7 of those little juveniles who were in the sanctuary, rescued from the bushmeat trade, to all the raw materials, and the first set of results there shows, well, they don't nut-crack. Not surprisingly, chimpanzees in East Africa don't. But we then exposed them to a model, so we're looking at the 3-year-old on the left, who's the subject in this case, watching 6-year-old on the right, who knows how to nut-crack now. And what happened, I'll show, first of all, just show you a little video clip. I'd like you to focus on watching the guy on the left and what it does in relation to what the one on the right is doing. Here we go. It doesn't last long, there's no sound, sorry. Yeah, so I mean, I'll really show that to show that, you know, the engagement that can be happened. This is just one chimpanzee who tended to do this, as it were, sort of outpouring of what was going on in his brain, you might say. But sure enough, we found that of the 4 chimpanzees exposed in this way, 3 of the 4 then started nut-cracking. And then in phase 3, we exposed all of those juveniles to the adult, and they all started nut-cracking, particularly the ones who'd already done it. So it takes a little while to build up the expertise to do that. So this, we think, is very strong, and I'm using the case study, as it were, of nut-cracking. We've got all this different kind of evidence converging, triangulating on the reality of the phenomenon about which we're drawing conclusions. But that's still only transfer from A to B. To have tradition, of course, we expect that a behavior has to be transmitted so it spreads across a group, and indeed from group to group, or from community to community, as chimpanzee groups are generally referred to. So in the case of nut-cracking, it would spread across hundreds of kilometers. So here we had a different kind of experiment, and I'm going to switch now to talking about captive chimpanzees in large colonies in the USA. This is our first time to do the kind of experiment that Kenny mentioned when he introduced me, that then has spun off into similar studies in artificial language learning, in which you introduce a behavior and then see, does it spread as you might predict if it's socially learned. So we have 2 groups of chimpanzees here, represented by the circles, and we present them all with the same problem. There's a grape which they would really like, and we get a whole series of these, but it's stuck behind a blockage in this thing we call the panpipes. So there's the blockage which was here, so they can't get the grape. It's a typical situation they face in the wild. There's some enclosed food. It would be the same if they're looking at a beehive, but with a tool they can get something out. And we take one chimpanzee out of the group and show it that by using the stick to lift the blockage out the way, they can release the grape and they'll get the grape. But then in this group here, we can't see the other group, we take one individual out and we show it you can poke the stick in, push the blockage backwards and knock the grape off the back, and it will roll forward and that individual will get the grape. So what we do in that way is create 2 experts who can solve this task, but do so in completely different ways. And we then reunite that expert with the rest of the community, who can, if they wish, come and watch, and may pick up the behavior, and that's the question. Well, the short answer is that they did. Before I show you those data, collated with others, I want to, having introduced the general idea of these diffusion experiments, move it on to that question I asked, well, do chimpanzees have the capacity for traditions to be transmitted from group to group, even? So here we take the same sort of general approach. We have, again, the same task which is presented to all the chimpanzees, or the same problem, but you can solve it in 2 different ways. You can either open up a hole here and stab the dates or whatever they are here and pull them out, or you can lift this little hatch here and push a tool in which pushes the dates out of the tunnel here. And what we've got here is three groups who can see each other through big windows. They can see their neighbours through windows. Another three groups who can't see the first triplet, but they again can see their neighbours through big windows. Here you can make them out at the back of the enclosure. But we introduce one technique here to just one chimpanzee, and the alternative technique to one chimpanzee here. And then we'll let the others see that, and then once half this group are doing it, we move it here so they can watch. And then they can have a go, and then we move it here so they can watch what these guys are doing, and then finally it's here, and we can see, so what does this group finally do, and compare that with what does that group finally do, as would be a sort of solution spread across here. So here's the model, doing it one way, the stab way, and here's an illustration of the model, not quite so active, doing it the other way. Let's see what happens in the first group, and already there's a highly significant contrast. Two little traditions are starting to be produced, except there's one individual, you can see there, this clever guy, who worked out, well, you could do it the other way. And that's the stab way, which for those of you who know chimpanzees is probably nearer the surface, we might say, and a chimpy kind of tool use. However, and so you might predict that, well, perhaps that behaviour is the one which will spread right across the groups as time goes on. But that did not happen. To the contrary, this third group here you can see is really just doing that behaviour that was seeded here, and which was the most common all the way along, even though there were these perturbations which somehow were rolled over by the cultural transmission process. So if you just remember those data, I'm going to plot them in a different way now, but you can see it's just the same stuff, and I plot it in that way because we can have the results of a second and actually slightly more complicated tool-use problem they were presented with. And if you look at the blue versus the green, as well as the purple versus the how's it coming out grey, you can see the same pattern here. So now we could say, if we're defining culture, as I've preferred to do, as the existence of multiple traditions, well, we've got the minimal basis for that. There are two traditions and therefore two different cultures. And to that we can add results from the Yerkes Centre, where we did a similar range of studies. And again, cultures made up of multiple traditions. Here's the panpipes result. That was the first approach that I mentioned. Here's the poke technique spreading across the whole group. And here the lift technique introduced and spreading across the whole group, although with a bit more corruption happening. Hand clasp grooming was not part of our experiment. In Africa, that's been seen at some sites and then absent at others. It was one of the first such social traditions to be identified by Bill McGrew and Carolyn Tutin. And interestingly, that arose spontaneously and then spread over a number of years in one group, but not in the other. So I've added it into the diagram. And once we know that, once we have that experimental evidence, then I think that sort of pushes a particular interpretation of the results of archaeological excavations. Here's Christoph Busch at his study site in the Thai forest, where nut cracking is going on the surface in the present day. And here he is illustrating some of the finds that have been made down at this level of nut cracking, which dates to over 4,000 years ago. So we're talking about very long-term traditions, at least in that one example. And there have been quite long-term inferences made on the basis of capuchin monkey nut cracking more recently, of at least of hundreds of years. So there's a quick gallop through, I think, some of our core findings from the chimpanzee analysis. So in terms of that comparison I talked about at the beginning, I'm just talking about us and our closest relative, the chimpanzee, or one of our two closest relatives, the common chimpanzee, rather than the bonobo. But other researchers come along soon after who were focused on orangutans and come up with very similar conclusions. That's to say, they're identifying a couple of dozen different traditions in orangutans, and then now, much more recently, the gorilla researchers have got together. And this is a big task, that this kind of cross-international and cross-Africa analysis to pull together, but they've finally done it for gorillas, and again come up with a figure of a couple of dozen different traditions of different kinds, not so focused on material culture or tool use, but other kinds of behaviour, like social behaviour. Now I'll just show you one other example of monkeys now from the New World, spider monkeys down here at the bottom, which in some ways perhaps occupy the ecological niche of chimpanzees, but in the New World, and you can see from Claire Santarelli's results, they've even tried to use the same kind of schematic that we used in that original paper to lay out the different traditions. Here, identifying, I think, the 22 different traditions. So I think that's all I want to say about the comparative primatology, that we can exploit very diverse forms of evidence to triangulate on culture. There's between population variations that I talked about. There's between neighbouring communities I talked about. The next thing, social network diffusion studies, I've not talked about the way in which you can use evidence of the way a new behaviour occurs and spreads, which has been reported recently, to identify culture because it spreads along the social network that's already been independently identified. I've talked about dyadic copying experiments, and then the most powerful from a culture point of view, I think, these cultural diffusion experiments. And my main conclusions there are apes and other primates too, to varying degrees, sustain multiple tradition cultures. And indeed, that social learning can reasonably be said to pervade the lives of apes and other primates. And that word pervades is one I've used in a couple of contexts recently. One is this paper, which surveys much more than primate social learning, but for those of you who are interested in that broader approach and broader coverage, I'll put that up. And then a paper that we've got in press now, I should be just seeing the proofs for that soon, I think, talking about the pervasive role of social learning in primate lifetime development. So through infancy and the juvenile phase, but then as at least one sex or other disperses when they're sexually mature, they move to a different community where they have a whole lot of new things to learn about what's best to eat there, where to find it, what the predators are likely to hang out, and also aspects of the social dynamics of the group that they're trying to move into. So that's a kind of a further phase. Now, I had put a few slides in here when I was sort of constructing this talk to say, well, it's not just primates, of course. There is work on cetaceans and other species, a big cetacean group we have at St Andrews. I think for purposes of time, I'm not going to go through that. I'll just whiz through the slides. If you want to, in question time, ask me about any of this stuff you see do. And I did put some of this in because it's about vocalizations. But this lovely book by Hal Whitehead and Luke Rendell can now draw on a big research literature. And their conclusion is culture, we believe, is a major part of what the whales are. In a sense, is the case I'm making by saying social learning is pervasive. And there are beautiful studies of vocalizations. There's 5 levels in humpback whales, and then studies of the way in which new songs arise and drift across the Pacific over a period of years. And these are really new songs, revolutionary new songs. Then, of course, there's the bird song literature, which you're probably already familiar with. We were hearing about that this morning. Just one example of dialect differences, but there's now a big research literature on those, just illustrated there. But it's not just bird song. There's lovely experimental work recently on the spread of, say, foraging techniques becoming traditions, and even bees. There's this wonderful study on bees who train to pull strings, to pull that little blue thing out and get the sweet stuff in the middle, spreading across a community where it doesn't happen in control groups. So that's why we've put together a number of papers reviewing all of this, a second inheritance system, which I think is actually extending biology as the study of life because of all these discoveries about the nature of culture. And in fact, there's a whole issue of PNAS which we brought out last year, the extension of biology through culture, and there's my grade 8 review, which is in that issue. That's all been made free, thanks to PNAS, so it's all free online. Have a look. Okay. So let me move on to the second part of the talk, where I've, as it were, made the effort, because I thought people in this audience would be particularly interested in the question of, well, how much evidence is there in our primate ancestry for socially transmitted vocalizations or gestures? And I think the basic answer, which you might anticipate, is not much. So here's a review by my colleagues, Dick Byrne, a certain person called Erica Cartmill, Pat Hobart, and others. Great Ape Gestures, and the clues in the title, communication with a rich set of innate signals. So they're really saying, and there are similarities right across the great apes. There is not exactly a fixed repertoire, and there may be some social learning tweaking it, but that's the basic conclusion. And then there are experimental studies, for example, this one headed by Claudio Tenni. I didn't know Claudio was going to be at the meeting, but he is here somewhere, in which what's done is to create a gesture, to train the animals to do a gesture, in this case, this kind of praying gesture. Mike Tomasello did the first of these kind of studies many years ago, but this is a more recent one and that's a bit more systematic. But the main conclusion is a gesture like that doesn't spread. So that seems to be really quite a strong contrast with the kind of evidence I was presenting earlier for the experimental spread of object-based actions, tool use and the like. It's almost like a kind of blind spot, you might say, for chimpanzees, because these chimpanzees doing this gesture are getting some reward, but they don't seem to pick up that if you make that gesture, that's what you can achieve. There's a study by Zana Clay with Claudio, and Zana was presenting this morning, of course, and she's at the meeting as well. This wasn't targeted at that, but I think it involved certain actions which were, as it were, just gestures in the air, which, perhaps not surprisingly, the bonobos in this study didn't copy. But the amazing thing is, but children do. So, that's all I'll say about gestures. I think when we start to switch to vocalization, things are a bit different. So one study building on Katie Slocum's early work, and we heard, what was it, in Zana Clay's talk this morning, a similar study for bonobos showing some kind of functional referentiality, creating, in this sense, to an artificial apple tree, an artificial bread tree, which have different value to the animals, and the vocalizations that they make at each of those, allowing you to tell which is the food today, and a primate, a chimp coming out of the exit there, would be able to know where to go on the basis of just the playback of the call itself. But I show that because a follow-on study by Stuart Watson and colleagues with Katie Slocum and her colleagues tracked the way in which these vocalizations, so this is principal components summary index here on the left. There was a group of chimpanzees in Edinburgh Zoo who were kind of long-term residents, we'll call those the Scots, and introduced then was another group of a similar size from a zoo in the Netherlands. And they started off making these kind of vocalizations in a discriminatingly different way. But over time, they converged. And that was over a period in which the social network changed from one in which there were these two subgroups, the residents and the immigrants, and then gradually they've coalesced to all be happily together and started vocalizing more in a similar way. So that's just one illustration which I put there because Stuart Watson's been my PhD student for the last few years. But a recent review by someone who's also now a colleague of mine, I'm pleased to say, Adriano Lanera. I know he's a common attendant at these meetings. I'm not sure if he is here. I expected him to be. But anyway, he wrote this review on evidence for primate vocal learning. And just to underline, he argues that over 20 studies qualify as positive evidence for primate vocal production learning following accepted terminology. So I just went through that paper and logged. We're talking about a lot of ape examples here, but also some for old world monkeys, like the Diana monkey there, and new world monkeys, like this pygmy marmoset, studied by people like Chuck Snowden. So, I'm not the expert to judge if he's right in these conclusions, but it seems that broad conclusions would be that there's a lack of evidence for copying gestures, more evidence, on some convergent evidence there across different species for vocal learning, limited vocal learning. And of course, my colleagues who study vocalizations and the social transmission of them in animals like humpback whales would look at that and say, well, how pathetic is that? But there's some evidence for it, I think. Okay, so now in the latter part of the third part of the talk, I want to swing back to some of our own research mostly, and talk about what I've here called cultural cognition, aspects of cultural transmission that I think are relevant probably to language evolution in various ways. The first one is copying sequential and hierarchical structure. And I was very pleased this morning as I dipped in and out of, I think, 3 different workshops. There was one on compositionality, another on word order, and another one on artificial language learning, and they were all basically related to what I'm going to talk about now, copying sequential and hierarchical structure. Although most of them, like I started off in the artificial language learning one, were showing that various species, from human infants to various non-human primates, rodents and birds, could discriminate different sort of rules of grammar, if that was could be argued, but not that it was necessarily picked up and built into an output, which of course is what we're really interested in ultimately in the case of language learning and language evolution. Whereas what I'm looking at is the copying of action, so that's exactly what I am looking at. Here's an illustration of one of the things we call an artificial fruit. The idea is it's an analogy of the kind of problem that the primates are dealing with in the wild. You have to manipulate it in various ways, twisting and pulling and tearing and whatever you have to do in the right way to get into the edible part in the middle. But they're particularly designed so that each thing that has to be done can be done in 2 very different ways. And of course, each individual in our experiment sees it done one way, or they are in the condition where they're seeing it done the other way, and then we can see what happens, like those diffusion experiments I was talking about. So this pin, for example, here can be just spun with a finger, or it can be turned like winding up a clock. And then that makes it possible to deal with the handle, which can either be turned round, so that allows a lid over here finally to be opened, or it can be pulled right out. And the bolts, well, one can poke them through with your finger, or you can get hold of them and pull them out, but we apply a twisting action, which isn't necessary, but again we can see, well, is that picked up? But the point is that all those things can be done in different sequential orders. And in this experiment, which is an old experiment, as you can see, what I did was work with 4 different chimpanzees, and these might be regarded as pretty much enculturated chimpanzees that were in Sue Savage Rumbaud laboratory, common chimpanzees. And here's a kind of graphical illustration of what each of one was exposed to. So this one sees, these are the bolts, the far bolt taken out, using the pulling and twisting action, and then the same thing with the inner bolt. The pin is then spun around several times, the pin's taken out, and then the handle can be released, and then the lid open. And this one sees the same behaviors used, but in the different order, so it's bolts last. And then the last 2 do the same kind of contrast between bolts first, bolts last, but these symbols indicate this is done using the stabbing with the finger. And what we found was that chimpanzees then who'd seen that, after they'd seen it a few times, and I'm going to show you the results for the third and final trial, did exactly what they had seen in terms of the sequential ordering. The only difference is just a kind of trivial one, really. This chimp took out the 2 bolts the other way around. The other one even did it. The other one did it in the same order they'd actually seen the bolts taken out. But interestingly, that wasn't true in the first trial, nor in the second one. So if we have here an index of similarity to the sequence that is seen, which one can construct, it was sort of slightly negative to begin with, then became slightly positive, and then jumped in the third trial to be almost perfect. I just pointed out that little trivial difference. So this seems like a progressive convergence on what they're seeing as the way this is done, because to begin with, they've seen it a few times and then they get the first trial, but then they see it again and do the second one, and then they see it again. So they see a familiar human being doing it in that exact same sequence, which they don't adopt to begin with, but which they gradually converge on. So I think that's interesting. And if you think about the logical structure of this kind of experiment, you're copying the sequential action structure here. The minimal you need is something where in one condition they're going to see A, then B, and in the other condition they're going to see B, then A. So we've done that, but then if we're interested in copying hierarchical action structure, then we need more elements which can be put into hierarchical trees. And I've illustrated it here in terms of 4 actions, A1, A2, B1, B2. And so one way to do a task like that is, first of all, to do A, 1 and 2, and then B, 1 and 2. Or you can do it as illustrated by the alternative hierarchical tree structure. You do 1 first, which means you have to do 1A and 1B, and then you do 2A and B. Now, we've implemented that, I think, most successfully in studies with young children learning on as it were, equivalents of these artificial fruits, much more complicated ones, in which instead of a 2x2 set of possibilities, we've got 4x4. So there are some bazillions of ways to actually go through this. But what children see on this thing, which we have silly names for all of these things. This is called a keyway fruit, because you create keys. So what you have to do is take one of these rods out of the middle, press it into one of these shapes. That gives you a key of a particular shape. Here's the bar one being pushed into this hole here. So it knocks out a rod which is in the middle. And when you've done all 4 of those, then you can take the lid off and get the reward inside. And so you can do it by what we call a column-wise approach. You make the tool for that hole, you push it in, you pull that rod out, and then you pull it out of the back, and then you do the next one, the next hole sequence like that, and then the next hole sequence, and the next hole sequence. Actually, this one is missing, so we missed that out, and then put it in at test to see whether they incorporate that into the hierarchical structure they saw shown, because the other way to do it is what we call row-wise. So first of all, you make all your tools, and then you push all your tools into the holes, then you pull all the rods out, okay? So, again, if I put up that illustration, oops. Yeah, so you've got the row-wise method here, doing A, B, C, D, and the column way I've illustrated as 1, 2, 3, 4, and the subcategories repeated there. And what we found, essentially, I'm not going to show you a graph. Yes, children copied this really quite faithfully. They made the distinction, so they were able to pick this up. But this is too finicky for chimpanzees to do, so we've invented, we've got more than one study on this. Too finicky for chimpanzees, so we've invented sort of more, one which can be done with big sausage fingers and less refined manipulation if you don't really have anything you could seriously call a thumb. And there it is, and chimpanzee engaged on it. I'm sorry to say we haven't brought that to the level of a paper to be submitted, and even though we've done this a while ago, and coming to present this at this conference made me think, well, clearly we should. From what I saw this morning, this could fill an interesting gap. Okay, but something I think that we have done that nevertheless perhaps addresses this issue is from this experiment, where what we did was expose young chimpanzees or young children to one of these artificial foraging tasks, where they saw a familiar caretaker, first of all take this stick tool, get rid of the defense across the top there, and then bash it into the box several times. And then they take it out, disable another thing here, a door, move that, open up a hole, push it in and extract a reward. Food for the chimps and a sticker for the children. And so that was one condition of the experiment, and we predicted there that a good copier is going to then run through that whole sequence. But we had a different prediction in the other condition, where it was exactly the same device, except it was totally transparent. And when that stick goes in to the top and just beats down, you can see there's just a kind of a layer here that it just hits on, and it can't really have any causal relationship to the good stuff that goes here later. So we thought an intelligent imitator would copy pretty much everything, or copy the whole sequence with the opaque device, but if you were in the condition with a transparent one, you'd be cleverer and miss out that first bit. But the results were completely different to that, insofar as, we thought, well, so that's what humans will do, right? Interesting question. What about the apes? Will they just mindlessly copy everything, or will they make a distinction? Well, the answer was that the chimpanzees did make the distinction. So they, in the transparent case, were much less likely to do that, significantly less, whereas in the opaque one, they were significantly more likely to do the whole thing. But children, however, copied everything in both conditions, and that's what's led to the phenomenon since called by others over-imitation, and become a sort of minor industry in developmental psychology and tested around the world and has been replicated as well. It's a very interesting phenomenon, I think. But what I'm pointing out here is that chimpanzees don't, in this case, obviously just kind of mindlessly copy the chain of things they saw. They can segment them and do all of them in one case, or most of them, and just a part of them which they judge relevant in another case. So that's all I say about that. Then there's the question of selective and rational imitation. Let me first of all show you what I'm talking about here. You perhaps know Andy Meltzoff's earlier research, in which he showed that even one-year-old infants, on seeing this bizarre behaviour, using your head to make an interesting light come on, would be copied if children even went home for a while and then came back, and that's what they would tend to pick up. The genius of Gergely et al. In their version of this was, in one condition, to have a blanket wrapped around the actor, so that in a sense all you could do was do it with your head. There was much more constraint to do that. In that condition, infants, the blue part of the graph, were much more likely to copy what they'd seen in the hands-free condition than in the hands-occupied one. And the explanation they gave there was that this doesn't necessarily imply a theory of mind, but at least some sophisticated theory of action. That these young infants are discriminating the significance of what you might want to do, what your goals would be, what your intentions are. And interestingly, then, that has been replicated in a study by David Buckelman and colleagues, not only using the light, but using one which creates a noise when you use your head like this. And even nicer, I think they did it with a foot, same idea, or even just sitting on something, either to make a light come on or to make a noise. I'm not sure what the noise was, but more likely to be copied by these apes, chimpanzees and gorillas when the hands are free than when the hands are occupied. So what's the relevance of that? Well, I think it is this notion they're referring to of a sophisticated sort of theory of action, or understanding of action, that goes beyond surface features. And I put this in there as much by trying to explain why it might be significant to language learning, to having an intuition that surely it might, and rather cast it out to this audience, hoping that one of you is going to come up to me in the reception and say, hey, that bit about rational imitation, here's the answer, that's why it's relevant, because you're the experts on language evolution. So I hope it's relevant. And the same is true of the next one. It's partly an intuition. What I'm talking about here, in calling this recognition of what it is to copy, is this kind of experiment, first done by the Hayes couple many years ago with this chimpanzee, Vicky, who was reared in their home. And what they said they'd done was to, first of all, use a little set of training actions to get her into the idea that when I say do this, you're supposed to try and copy it. And then they exposed her to a battery of more novel actions to see what she would do. Well, I mean, it wasn't very rigorous, and so we replicated it a number of years ago, now with 2 young chimpanzees, not enculturated chimpanzees. And here's some of the results, but I'm not going to go through the results, but all I want to say about this is that it was possible to get the ape to understand this is the game. And Joseph Carl did it with an enculturated orangutan, Chantek. Is my way of remembering the name of one of our hosts. people have tried to do this with monkeys, and they've failed. They've tried, several different research groups have tried to get monkeys to play the Simon Says, as it were, do as I do game, and they've not been able to get them to do it. So there seems to be something about great apes, at least we've got chimpanzees and orangutans here, getting it. And that seems to me to imply that they understand something about what it is to copy, and so if they see something, they can later, as it were, you might say, decide to copy that, or some part of that that they deem relevant, which again seems to me relevant to the use of language by young children and the phase that they go through. But again, I'm quite open for you to come and tell me, yeah, that is relevant because blah, blah, blah. Okay, and then the final part, I think I'm doing okay for time. Perfect. I won't say much of this, particularly now I've discovered Claudio tennis of yours. Cumulative culture is claimed by many, well, yes, it's claimed by many to be unique to our species. That's really what differentiates culture in our own species from culture in any other, such as chimpanzees. And of course, there's some obvious truth in that. You know, chimpanzees do not have all of this, and they don't have conferences like this and so on. So back to my gulf at the beginning. Well, okay, perhaps there is a gulf when we start talking about cumulative culture. And I say, many authors say it's a dichotomy. There's us and there's them. Some of us think that's premature, at least. And I'm just going to show you one illustration of this. Well, two. So, one observational. This is from work by Cricket Sounds, and if the video will play. So here you've got chimpanzees who are going to go termite fishing, and they've arrived at this clearing. There are going to be several of them appear in a moment. They've all come to the same place, and they've come, as you can see, with long stems, green stems, fresh stems already in their mouth. They're going to use the termite, but they can't start straight away. What they've got to do is what this guy's doing, take a thick stick, and then make an indentation in the ground in the right place. And then it's going to push that stick down. Extraordinary. It's like Mr. McGregor digging his garden, I always say, with a spade. And he's going to make a tunnel at least a couple of feet down. And there's no sign really there that, you know, this is a good thing to do, other than that, well, this is what chimps here do. And that makes a tunnel, and so then pull the thick stick out, and then use the long fishing probe to put down it very carefully, as I say, sometimes 2 or even 3 feet to get the termites. And before they do that, they push it through their teeth to make a particular brush tip, which isn't common elsewhere. So I'm going to go on from that. The point is that, you know, chimpanzees, that they're coming to a situation which seems really totally opaque. You know, how would anyone know there's something there? And they're way down beneath the ground, but they do know what to do, and by copying what experts are already doing, you can get there. It seems difficult to imagine to us, those of us who know chimpanzees, that this could appear, as it were, anew every generation, rather that it might have started as something close to the surface. Termites do termite in mounds at various levels, and then somehow got deeper and deeper and deeper until now it's something you can start with, a very opaque and challenging situation of this stuff feet beneath the surface. But, of course, we don't have the history of that. We don't have the history for quite a lot of human stuff, which we assume is cumulative. But of course, we do have historical records. We can trace the cumulative evolution of the wheel or, you know, digital technology in our lifetime. So we started doing experiments on this. I'm just going to finish with one illustration of this, where chimpanzees have been presented with a receptacle full of juice. And they've got various tools available to get this, things they can dip into the juice and straws they could use to suck it up. But as the level goes down, there's only one tool here, which is really the great one to use, and that's the one at the bottom, called the long bendy tool. And to use that, you've got to unbend the tube, you've got to open the valve at the end, which is a kind of secret trick. You've got to do that and then realize that you can use it to suck the juice. In our experiments, we seeded some of that in some individuals, and sure enough, it spread across those groups. Others didn't work it out. At least it didn't work it out originally. But in the control group, we were interested that some did, and it's rather intriguing what they did. And this gets a bit anecdotal at this point, but let me just guide you through it. What we've got is up to phase 2. Nobody's really solved it. But what happens is that Tanya here unscrews the valve, but without realizing that means you've now got a wonderful long straw. But Barn comes and sucks juice through Tanya's modified tool, so succeeds, and Catherine comes and observes Barn doing that, and then she sucks juice. So at this stage, there's some social learning perhaps in the case of Catherine, but in any case, even with, who was it, Barn, you've got the chimpanzees as a group managing to get some success from this, but by one chimpanzee doing part of the action and another chimpanzee doing the other part. Then in phase 3, it shifted on apparently by social learning, because Barn observed Nicky unscrew, and then went on to unscrew themselves, so they already knew how to suck. So now they've got it all. They can perform their known suck behaviour that they used with other straws with this new unscrew behaviour. And then the converse happened here, with Nicky observing someone sucking from the tool. They already knew how to work the valve, and they do the whole thing as well. So you've got a sort of minimal accumulation here. I think that was what's of interest there. We perhaps might not claim it's actually cumulative culture, but you can see it's the seeds of that kind of thing. So that's me done, I think, more or less on time. I'm not going to every level of this, summarising what I said. Those were the elements of the talk, and I think I've mentioned what the conclusions were. I seem to think this is somewhat like something that was embedded in this paper, and I imagine there's lots of people in the audience say, oh, God, does he think that's a robot? I thought what was the interesting message in this paper, as I remember reading it from my former colleague, to come to Fitch and a couple of others, is that rather than trying to work out what's the sort of magic answer to the evolution of language, one can do it in terms of bits and pieces, and ultimately these various bits and pieces got put together. So what I've been illustrating, I hope, is some of those bits and pieces which might be relevant to you. And with that, I think I'm done, apart from thank my many collaborators and co-authors over the years on the last couple of decades of research on this, and various funders. Thank you.